Okay, so now we've gone through sort of the core representational levels of language, phonetics, phonology, morphology, syntax, and semantics, but we've been making an idealization about the brain basis of language, which is that we've been assuming that there's only one language in the brain. But in fact, for most people in the world, that's actually not the case. So the majority of the world's population actually houses representations for more than one language in their brains. So now we're going to talk a little bit about the bilingual brain. And this is obviously a large topic, a big literature. So I'm just going to give you a brief introduction. And specifically, I want to focus on 3 questions. So the first question is whether different languages occupy different parts of your brain. Second question is has to do with the situation where you're using one language and the other language is not being used. What is the status of that language that is not being used? Is it completely turned off, totally like asleep, or is it to some extent active even when you're using the other language? And then finally, what do we know about the brain mechanisms of language switching of the sort that bilinguals like to do? Okay, so let's talk about the first question first. So do different languages occupy different parts of your brain? Relevant to this question is whether different languages in general have distinct neurobiological implementations. Usually when we address this question, we find much more similarity than differences. So by and large, the neural basis of language is much more similar across languages than different. So I'm going to give you one example here. So this is Russian versus English. And so this is a broad network that's activated by just the English speakers listening to English stories and the Russian speakers listening to Russian stories. And as you can see here, the networks that are activated are really astonishingly similar. So obviously a lot of the brain is activated by, this complex task of listening to a story in all its glory. But still, we see a lot of similarity. This study uses kind of a cool technique where you're actually looking at the extent to which one participant's brain activity as they're listening to that story correlates with other participants' brain activity. And so it turns out that our brains go remarkably in sync when we're encountering some kind of a meaningful stimulus. So that's not a bilingual finding. So of course, the question that we're interested in here is what it looks like when you kind of stuff both of these languages into the same brain. So here, we have really informative data from electrocortical stimulation mapping. So when we look at this question at a sort of macroscopic level, so looking at like say fMRI activation for your, say, for one language versus the other one as they're both occupying the same brain, at that kind of macroscopic level, usually we see a lot of similarity. So they don't really separate. But when we zoom into the details, which the type of electrocortical stimulation mapping that we've already talked about allows us to do. So remember, this is a technique that is applied only in clinical settings when these patients are about to have brain surgery, and we're trying to figure out exactly what the contributions, the functional contributions of the areas are that are close to the site that the resection might target. And so from this kind of data, we have learned a great deal about how a person's languages might separate. So obviously, if we're going to do surgery on a bilingual person, we want to understand both of their languages, what the neural instantiation of both of the languages is. So here is an old study from '78, George Orgeman and colleagues, making these measurements from bilingual English-Dutch individual. And the most typical task in these kinds of measurements is a picture naming task. So here we would be asking this individual, the patient, to name pictures either in English or in Dutch. So they would get a picture and then they would have to say like, oh, name this in English or name this in Dutch. And so now the way the data are going to be annotated here is that there's going to be a circle at each stimulation site. And if the full circle is filled in, then both of those languages were affected at that site, meaning that when they interfered processing at that site, the patient was not able to do the naming task either in Dutch or in English. If only the bottom half is filled in, then only English was affected. And that is this person's L2. So the language that they learned later is not really a balanced bilingual. And if the top of the circle is filled, then only Dutch was affected. There's going to be some striped data points. That means that some of the trials were affected within the language and others were not. And if you see an asterisk, that means that only one trial from the set of trials that they tested was affected. So that's like a statistically insignificant, non-significant result. Okay, so here's then the data from that old paper. So here it's the half-filled situations that we're interested in. So for example, over here in frontal cortex, there is a site at which only English was affected, okay? So here he failed on all the English trials and none of the Dutch trials. So this is a clear site where like the English representations were somehow implemented, but the Dutch ones were not. And then, for example, here we also see a pretty interesting dissociation. So in this case, all the Dutch trials are affected because the top of the circle is filled in. Only one English trial was affected. So that suggests a pretty compelling contrast. And at a very close by site, the reverse is true. So here, English is affected, but he missed only one Dutch trial. So, and in later research, we have more examples of these types of cases. So when it comes to this first question, the answer is different languages are not typically spatially dissociated in broad terms, but when we examine the details, it is probably the case that the representations of your languages kind of sit next to each other, not occupying exactly the same cortex in most cases. Okay, what about the second question? So when you're using one language, what's going on with the other one? So for example, I'm a pretty balanced English-Finnish bilingual. What's going on with my Finnish right now as I'm talking to you in English? All right, so here I'm going to show you some nice data from Thierry and Wu. This is a paper that was published in 2007, where they, so this lab is in the UK, and they had Chinese English bilinguals come into the lab. And these subjects did an experiment in English. There was no mention about Chinese at all. The whole experiment was in English. Everyone was speaking English, no Chinese happening. And they did a very straightforward semantic priming study. So it's kind of like N400 study that we've talked about. So you have related cases with Carpenter. Okay, so that's the kind of situation in which you'll get an N400 amplitude reduction in an EEG measurement versus unrelated cases, ham, train, those are not related at all. The N400 will be bigger. But unbeknownst to these subjects, the materials were actually divided into two sets. So in one set, if you translated the words into Chinese, they actually shared a character, okay? So in one set, that was the case. So these would be the character sharing pairs. So as you can see, there's a shared Chinese character. So these are now translations that the subjects are not seeing. And similarly here in the semantically unrelated case, there's a character that's repeating if you translate the words into Chinese. So if you think about it in terms of like English, like this ham train, that could be like a spinach spin type pair in English where the two spins have nothing to do with each other, but they still are have the same form. And then in the other half of the materials, that was not the case. So this is like no form relatedness in the Chinese translations. So, so this measurement is interesting because here we can hypothesize that if the subjects, while they're processing or doing the task completely in this English context, are nevertheless activating the corresponding Chinese words, then we might get an effect of this form relatedness in addition to the semantic priming effect that we would expect, like everyone predicts that. But it's only if the Chinese is kind of sufficiently activated to also get a form, an effect of the form relationship, then that's sort of informative of the question of what's going on with the language that's not in use. This is just a reminder of what our N400s look like. So remember, an unrelated condition will give you this bigger N400 than the related condition. So we think of this as basically a lexical priming effect. Okay, so here's the data. First of all, we have some English monolinguals also participating in the experiment. This is the semantic priming effect that we would expect. Here's our unrelated, the solid lines are the unrelated cases. They are giving us these more robust negativities, and then the semantic priming effect is clearly seen here. And the Chinese English bilinguals show a similar effect. Looks a little smaller, but basically you get a similar N400 effect. Then let's look at the effect of form relatedness. So here's main effect of character repetition, okay? So now, of course, in the English monolinguals, we're not gonna see an effect. They don't speak Chinese. There's no way that they would show that effect. So it's a good thing that we don't see it. So that's sort of a sanity check on the stimuli. However, the Chinese English bilinguals do show a significant effect of character repetition. So here we kind of also see an N400 effect. So whenever the character repeats, the N400 is a little bit smaller. So some kind of priming effect going on as well, but now like very unconscious, very tacit. They additionally had a group who did the task that was Chinese monolinguals doing the task in Chinese. So that gives us a nice measurement of what the form relatedness effect looks like if you're actually encountering the forms as opposed to the English translations. And so here we see an effect that's really similar looking to the ones that the bilinguals elicited just kind of covertly. So this is the Chinese monolinguals looking at the actual Chinese stimuli and showing a very similar effect. Okay, so we have various types of evidence that even when a language is not being used, it is still active and can affect the processing of the language that is in use. Okay, so how does the brain then switch between languages? So a very popular paradigm in the literature has been one in which you elicit language switching via relatively artificial cues in the laboratory setting. So here, for example, is an example of that type of an experiment. So let's just say that you have English, Arabic bilinguals participating in the study, and their task is to name the numbers that are on the screen. So here in English, you would say 5. But then the color of the number tells you what language you're supposed to use in your naming or in the production. So here If it's green, say it in English. If it's red, say it in Arabic. It's an example of a paradigm. So this is, you'll find lots of studies in the literature that use this type of experimental design. There is a very well-replicated result from this type of design as well, and that is that switching languages is difficult. So whenever the previous trial asks you to do the task in one language, and then the next trial asks you to do it in the other language, there's a cost to that switch, both behaviorally, but then also in the executive control regions of your brain, which are mostly in the prefrontal cortex. So switching is hard, heavily recruits these prefrontal executive control systems. And there's even a hypothesis that has gained both a lot of controversy and a lot of press that's sort of based on this type of finding. And that is that the idea is that in the bilingual brain, therefore, these executive control regions kind of get extra exercise, which in general leads to better control and inhibitory mechanisms. And this is called a bilingual advantage. Very controversial and kind of complicated, actually. So the question that we then would be interested in, given that this paradigm is quite artificial, is whether language switching under more ecologically valid conditions is actually costly. Is it hard to switch languages? As a bilingual, you don't really have that intuition because bilinguals switch languages so much. And also, so to what extent does this kind of more natural language switching engage these executive control systems? So when do bilinguals switch languages in the actual world? Well, first of all, they switch languages when they want to, okay? So if you are conversing with a person who is similarly bilingual to you, then you can switch languages whenever you want to and still be understood. So if I have a friend who is balanced English, Finnish bilingual, we switch back and forth quite a lot because it does not hamper the comprehensibility of the language. But then, of course, so that's just to give you the terminology from the field. This is called a dense code switching context, where you can kind of freely switch with a similarly bilingual person. But then, of course, sometimes we have to switch. So if I'm first talking to one person who only speaks English, and then I switch to another person who only speaks Finnish, I have to switch my language because otherwise it just won't be understood. So when switching from conversing with person A to person B, and they both just command one of your languages, this is what's called a dual language context. All right, so with my former student, Esti Blanco y Loreta, we have studied bilingual language switching quite a lot. And specifically, we've done these studies on the NYU Abu Dhabi campus with English Arabic bilinguals. And so in one study, we were interested in modeling this kind of constrained dual language switching and the free or dense language switching in the lab. And we wanted to kind of compare the popular artificial paradigm with more natural versions of that that still are kind of laboratory studies. And so in particular, we had people come into the lab and they were all English Arabic bilinguals. So NYU Abu Dhabi students mostly. And they were introduced to some characters and they were introduced to their linguistic profiles. So they were told that, okay, you're gonna be conversing with some monolingual people in this experiment and then some bilingual people. And so for example, here, I have the monolinguals interlocutors. So we would say like, okay, here's Brooke. She only speaks English. So whenever you're interacting with Brooke, you've got to speak English. And here's Mona. She only speaks Arabic. So when you're talking to Mona, you have to speak Arabic. And then we would also have a bilingual person, say Mira. And so it's like, well, when you see Mira, you can always just choose whatever language you want. She understands both languages. So that's the dual context. You got to change language according to the person, and this is the dense context. And then we also had like those artificial color cues as the really like artificial laboratory context. So this also like forces you to switch. So it's like the dual context, but without the people. So, you know, so here we're trying to make it more natural by actually giving you social context. So the task is again picture naming, like it was in the earlier in the Ojaman stimulation mapping study. So you would get a picture and your task is to name it. But before the picture, instead of a color cue in the more natural versions, you would get the person. Okay, so for example, if I'm now in the dual task, so you have to switch languages according to the person. I would have to say this in English because Brooke only speaks English. So then I would say key. Okay. And then the experiment proceeds, and maybe the next one would be Mona. Okay, now I'm talking to Mona, and I would then name the picture in Arabic. We had those little, you know, this kind of looks like an iPhone screen because we really wanted to like make it feel as natural as possible. So, oh, here's Brooke calling, and you're just going to say key. Clearly still a laboratory task, but we're just trying to make it a little bit more natural. Okay, so remember we still had the color cues as well. So this would be the color cue that tells you like with the green is English, you're gonna say key and so forth. Okay, so that's in some sense a replication of the prior literature. And then we add the social context. So what happens? So on here on the right side, I have our data. What we see is that in those executive control regions, when we're doing the well-known artificial task, we get exactly those increases of activation when you're switching, both in dorsolateral prefrontal cortex and in anterior cingulate cortex. And those are replications of the prior literature. Similarly, your production times are slower when you're switching. Okay, so that's a replication. So now we're interested in like, okay, let's just make them people. To what extent does the result still persist? Persist a little bit. Okay, so we see in dorsolateral prefrontal cortex, we still see an increase for the switch trials, but we no longer see a behavioral cost. That's interesting. And we don't see an effect in the other region that also showed a switch cost for the artificial cues. So it seems like your mind is working a lot less hard as soon as the context is a little bit more natural. What about in this freely switching context now? So here you're talking with Mira. You can use English or Arabic because she understands both. You can just say, whichever comes to mind first. And so here we notice that there are no switch costs at all. So when it's basically your decision to switch, it's not costly. Okay. And as you can see, actually the bar graphs trend in the other direction, not significantly though, but that's the trend. Okay, so that's a replication of the behavioral switching cost and prefrontal engagement for artificial cues. Second, no behavioral cost and less prefrontal engagement in this more natural dual language context. And then finally, in the dense freely switching context, no behavioral cost and no prefrontal increase for switches in this final context. Okay. So how does the brain switch between languages? Well, in a highly context-dependent way, the more natural the switching situation, the less brain effort is recruited. Although when the switching is mandated by the context, meaning like you are now talking to a different person who does not speak the language that you were just talking, then it's always a little bit costly. In the same study, we also learned that if you're listening to a natural conversation, like just two people talking and they're constantly switching languages, and if you are bilingual in the same way that the people that you're listening to, your brain has zero effort. There are no costs associated with listening to those switches at all. So that's another finding that we obtained from that study that is kind of pertains to the comprehension side of things. So like I said, bilingualism is a big topic. There's lots of literature, but if you would like to learn more about it at this kind of introductory level, I highly recommend that you read or listen. There's a really beautiful audiobook version of this. Albert Costa's The Bilingual Brain that just came out earlier this year. Albert Costa passed away prematurely a couple years ago, which is very sad, but his voice is beautifully preserved in this book, and I really, really highly recommend it. It's a great summary of the science, but it also really exemplifies how all scientists should write in a really, really accessible way.